Hello, viewers and listeners. Welcome back to another edition of Thomas's F1 Race Reviews. It's Baku GP edition this week. Got a little bit to talk about, a few accidents, a bit of strategy. It was actually, considering we had 6 red flags in qualifying, which was a record, it was actually quite a dull race. I thought we were going to have like 4 or 5 safety cars today, but that didn't happen, which is fine. Still got some stuff to talk about. Now, apologies for missing Monza. I was still quite ill during that weekend, so I didn't get a chance to record the podcast, so apologies for that. But if you guys want to stay up to date with everything that's going on, you can join my Discord. A link will be in my YouTube bio and in my Spotify bio as well. So thank you all so much for listening. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who's been tuning in so far. It means the world to me. And let's get into some Baku GP chat. Fresh in the back, that is... Okay, so as always, we're going to do this in chronological order. I'm also going to try and do the whole podcast in one take today, because it make my life easier, and I know a lot of podcasters do that, so I'm going to try a similar thing. But I guess we're going to start with possibly the biggest talking point of the race. I know definitely the most impactful part of the race, which is Piastri crashing out on lap 1. Now, obviously, Oscar hasn't made too many mistakes this season. Obviously, there was Australia, which wasn't ideal. But apart from that, he's been fairly clean. But to, crash in qualifying yesterday and then crash in the race today is not ideal for the bloke. And really, probably has the biggest impact on the championship. I would say even more so than Norris's engine failure in Zandvoort. But it was a pretty big mistake. Obviously, he jumped the start. Well, he jumped the start and then stopped the car. But then because he stopped the car, that caused it to go into anti-stall mode, which is why he dropped to the back of the pack before the start. When I was watching, I noticed like all the cars came into turn 1, and I was going, "Where's Oscar?" Because I saw Lando in the middle of the pack, but Oscar wasn't there. So he dropped to the back of the pack because with the anti-stall, by the time he got the car going again, he was already at the back. And then he spent the first half a lap at the back of the pack trying to get past, the likes of Gasly, Ocon, Behrman, and Hulkenberg. And then got into turn, turn 5 and 6, and got on the outside of the track. Obviously, it was quite windy. There was lots of leaves there as well, and it was the dirty side of the track. Obviously, we had the F2 going around earlier. And just locked up, went straight in the wall, and that was game over on lap 1. And in my opinion, that was all caused by the jump start. Now, whether it was a case of he jumped the start because he was trying to predict the lights, or whether simply his hand just slipped off the clutch, I don't know. But this whole crash all came down to him jumping the start, because he was driving angry, he was flustered, he was like, "Oh my god, I'm at the back of the pack and my teammate is up in 7th at the moment. I need to try and get back up the pack as quickly as I can." And he's just, he's gone for a move and it's just gone straight in the wall. So not ideal for Oscar, but I won't talk about it too much because it is simple as that. It is a rookie mistake. Obviously, he's only in his 3rd season, but there's no denying the fact that he made a mistake, a Lando-level mistake, on lap 1. And if he makes any more of those, he might be in a bit of hot water, because if he makes mistakes like that again, obviously Lando didn't capitalize this week, finishing 8th. But if he does that, let's say in Singapore or in Qatar or whatever, and Lando ends up winning, that has massive championship implications. So while he's made a mistake this weekend, definitely his fault. It's a rookie mistake. He cannot do it again, because if he does it again, that's going to be really, really, really costly. So we're going to move away from the Piastri incident now. Obviously, that caused a safety car, but that didn't have too much effect on anybody. Ocon, Gasly pitted, but that doesn't really matter too much. But we're going to move on to really the only other bit of contact in the race, which is quite surprising considering how many red flags we had in qualifying yesterday. But that crash was between Albon and Colapinto. Obviously, Albon down at the arse end of the field after crashing in qualifying yesterday. He was one of the ones that brought out red flags after hitting the wall at the inside of turn one. And, you know, seeing his teammate up in the podium positions, obviously he would have wanted to get through the field. Trying to overtake Colapinto, it was right front wheel to left rear wheel contact, sent Colapinto into the wall. Now, off the top of my head, I believe Albon did get a penalty for this, which is understandable. It was Albon's fault. Some would, obviously the Colapinto haters would jump on the train that he left the door open. Now, yes, Franco did leave the door open. What's happened is Albon has sort of had a half look. Colapinto, being a rookie, has gone, oh my god, I've got a Williams on the inside, and has hesitated to turn in, which has invited Albon to have even more of a look at the inside. And then Colapinto's gone, you know what, no, I am going to turn in. And he's done so. Albon's got like the front wing alongside, and it's right front to left rear, turning Colapinto around. So some would say it's a racing incident. Personally, I think it's Albon's fault. He was just a bit too late in with the move, and it caused Colapinto to spin. But then again, it is a learning moment for Colapinto to not leave the door open, because getting to the apex, there was a Williams-sized gap there for Albon to go in. Wasn't going to happen, but there was an invitation for Albon to have a look. So it's a learning moment for Colapinto. It's not his fault in the grand scheme of things, but that's something for him to learn on for the future. But yeah, definitely a penalty for Albon. I believe it was a 5-second penalty, which is justified. I don't think it was worthy of 10 seconds. Obviously, you know, Colapinto was spun backwards, but the contact wasn't actually that heavy. I usually tend to base off, you know, how heavy the contact is rather than the result from it, if that makes sense. So it wasn't actually that heavy contact. And yeah, I think a 5-second penalty is fairly fair, I think, in that instance. Okay, so now we're going to move on. I've divided this into 3 or 4 sort of segments, but we're going to move on to strategy. Obviously, with it being a dull-ish race, there was quite a bit of strategy at play. But the main thing, which I wanted to talk about, is I did not expect the guys who started on mediums to go all the way to like lap 39, lap 40 of a 51 lap race. That was quite unexpected. What I thought was going to happen, right? I thought, you know, we were going to start the race. Obviously, we had the safety car, which saves the tyres a little bit. You know, usually if there's a safety car, you can extend your stint, depending on the track, by about 4 or 5 laps, there or thereabouts. But I thought the guys were going to stop, you know, on lap 25, lap 26-ish. But that didn't happen today. You know, we didn't see, you know, obviously Leclerc pitted a bit earlier, so did Liam Lawson. Those were the outliers with the strategy today. But the likes of Tsunoda, Norris, George Russell, Carlos Sainz, and Max Verstappen, you know, they did not pit right until up about lap 40 or so. So that was a very, very late stop for those guys. Something I didn't expect. And it brings up the question once again. You know, we seem to return to this every few months or so of, you know, can Pirelli actually make a good tyre? Obviously, for those of you who pay attention to the tyre allocation each weekend, you know, we had the C6, the C5s, and the C4s, which are the softest in the Pirelli range. And, you know, for the last 4 or 5 years, the C5s, which were the mediums this weekend, have been the softest tyre. Obviously, the C6s were introduced this year, And they are the softest tyre. No one even dared going near those, which is understandable because they can't even do a qualifying lap, those tyres. But the fact that, we're getting the second softest tyre in the Pirelli range, the C5, and we're doing, 40 laps on these tyres, it's just a bit silly. Like, and it goes to show, right? We've got the C6 tyre not being able to do one qualifying lap, and we've got the next step above doing 40 laps. And it just goes back to that point. We have this debate every few months or so of Pirelli do not know how to make, a good tyre. And this is opinion which not a lot of people have that I have. And I think a way to solve this issue, let's bring back the tyre war, Obviously, if you look back to 2005, 2006, when you had Michelin versus Bridgestone, you had seven out of the 10 teams on Michelin tyres and then the other 3 on Bridgestone tyres, and that created, a different dynamic to the race. It wasn't just, C4, C5, C6 tyres as the strategy. You had Michelin and Bridgestone bringing different spec tyres to each race, and that made it quite interesting. But yeah, it just goes back to, we're at a stage now, well, Pirelli are at a stage where their softest tyre cannot complete one qualifying lap without overheating, but their second softest tyre is able to do 40 laps around Baku. And it just, in a way, it does just ruin the racing because it makes the strategy so predictable. Like after lap 20, you saw them going, oh, right, if they haven't pitted now, they're going to extend as much as they can. And that was predictable in a way. Obviously, I didn't think they were going to do that at first. But after seeing them get to lap 25, I was like, yeah, they're going to extend all the way to the end. And in a way, it kind of ruins the racing because obviously one stops can get a bit dull. Obviously, there are some people who like one-stop strategies. I personally don't. I would much rather see a two-stop, but that didn't happen today. And once again, it raises that question of Pirelli and the way they make their tires. But moving on from Pirelli and the one-stop strategy, we're going to move into another talking point of this strategy race, which was Ferrari. And not really any other way to put it, a bit of a disaster class again. Now, the way I always like to think about it, right, Ferrari never have good strategy calls. And the reason for that is Ferrari will look at the likes of Red Bull and Mercedes, who are much more confident in making bold strategy calls, and Ferrari go, yes, we can do that. So they try something different and get it horrifically wrong every single time. The way that Ferrari are going to get points in the future and right now is just by copying everyone else. I guarantee you that if Ferrari took a look at Red Bull, they took a look at Mercedes, and they took a look at McLaren, and they said, right, we are going to do what they do, this would, in all honesty, get them featuring much more often in the top 5, top 4. But it's just I don't know if it's an Italian thing, I don't know if it's a Ferrari thing, but they try these bold strategies, and because they're Ferrari, they never work out. And the perfect example was today with Charles Leclerc. Like they pitted Charles Leclerc. Charles was the first one out of the top 8 to pit. He pitted, 15 or 16 laps before the leaders. Carlos Sainz, George Russell, and Max Verstappen all coming in 16 or 17 laps after Charles Leclerc. And when you pit that early, while it might give you some pace in the middle of the race, obviously being on fresher tyres, come the end of the race, you're just so much slower. And Ferrari, when they try these bold strategies, it just always ends up in tears. Obviously, they brought Charles in, and we're thinking, this might work, but it's still very risky. But then Racing Bulls got their act together and immediately saw, oh my god, Charles Leclerc is going to undercut Lawson, so let's pit Lawson to cover the Ferrari, which is the obvious thing to do. See, once again, a team like Racing Bulls, who shouldn't be competing with Ferrari, making the sensible, logical strategy call and pitting and covering the Ferrari of Leclerc, not doing anything silly, unlike what Ferrari did, and, bringing Lawson out in front of Leclerc and holding him up for the whole race. That is how you secure, P5. Lawson finished in 5th place. And in this day and age of Formula One, while it might sound a bit cliche, you just got to not do anything stupid. Just got to play it by the book. It was a textbook strategy for Lawson and Racing Bulls today, and that's what allowed them to finish in front of Charles Leclerc and Ferrari, because Ferrari just week in, week out are trying these bold, audacious, and quite frankly stupid strategies when all they need to do is just do what everyone else does, and they can finish in the top 5. But it got to the point where the strategy was so bad they even swapped the cars towards the end of the race. I think it was on lap 46 or lap 45 or something, where they actually swapped Leclerc and Hamilton because Hamilton was on the better tyres. Obviously, he pitted, while not with the likes of Russell, Antonelli and Sainz, but he pitted nearer to them compared to what Leclerc did. And he had that tyre advantage over Charles come the end of the race. And it just goes to show that, once again, Ferrari just don't need to be doing these silly strategies, especially with Charles. We don't know if Charles argued it. We don't know if he agreed with it. But no other word for it apart from disaster class from Ferrari today. But let me have a bit of water. And we're going to move on. We're going to talk about my GOAT today, finally. We don't actually talk about George that much these days. But we're going to talk about, a fairly solid race. A fairly solid race from George today. Started P5. I wasn't sure if he was going to be able to pick up the win or not. Obviously, Verstappen just romped away with it after lap 5. But, to go from 5th to 2nd, not a bad effort. He actually had the pace today. Whether it was a good strategy or not, obviously, he did exactly what Verstappen did, which I think is one of the big things which allowed him to jump Sainz. Obviously, Verstappen pitted, I believe, on about lap 42, lap 41. George was within the lap of that. So I think that was one of the key factors which allowed George to jump Antonelli, to jump Sainz in the pits. So, and he just had good pace. They asked him on lap 38, how are the tyres feeling? And George was like, yep, they're feeling good. They're feeling good. Just leave me to it, and we'll box when we need to box. And that is one thing with George. I think he is one of those drivers on the grid which is quite good at being fast while also being a good tyre saver. And that is a crucial skill in this day and age of Formula One. When almost every race is a one-stop, being able to be quick and being able to conserve tyre wear at the same time is quite a useful skill. So it was a good race from Russell today, and any excuse to talk about my number one on the grid. But that is it for the strategy, and we are going to move on to the title fight, because obviously with Oscar crashing, it opens up the door for a bit of discussion. Should Norris have capitalised? Is the championship back on for Max? It opens up a few questions, but we're going to talk about it. And I guess with the next talking point behind Oscar is, should Lando have capitalised more today? Obviously, he qualified 8th, started 8th, and finished 8th. He was running up in 4th position at one point in time, but that was just because people had pitted earlier before him. Obviously, he had another slow stop, and he did mention in his post-race interview that, it's always me having these slow stops. Whether that's luck of the draw, whether there's some sort of inter-team bias going on like in 2007 between Alonso and Hamilton, it's hard to tell, but that slow stop didn't help again. But it is interesting at the fact that it was, 3 races in a row now. We have had Baku, he had a slow stop. Monza, he had the crucial slow stop. And then even in Zandvoort, his first stop before the engine failure was slower than Oscar. And, it begs the question, is Andrea Stella, calling the shots, trying to hold up Lando, and trying to get on Zach Brown's nerves? We don't know. But whether or not that cost him a bit of time, Norris really should have capitalised more today. Finishing in 7th place, or in 8th place, in 7th place, finishing in 7th place, it's only a 6-point gain, which means the championship now, Oscar has a 25-point lead, which is still 1 win for Lando and a DNF for Oscar gap, which is a fairly big gap. And I think with the pace of that McLaren, yes, it can be hard to overtake at Baku, but I think Lando should have finished at least in the top 5 today. He shouldn't have been in P7 because he just needs to capitalise more. Whether he took it too easy, we're not entirely sure. But with the pace that McLaren has been showing all season, Lando should have been in the top 5. And, it's moments like these where Norris just doesn't capitalise. We saw it last year, with the best example being in Brazil 2024. He was starting P2 and Max was starting 17th, yet Max wins the race and Lando finishes 8th. It's these crucial races where he has these huge swings where he can make a difference and he just doesn't capitalise on it. And I honestly think it does come down to not being able to soak up the pressure. He gets into these races and he goes, oh my God, I've got this huge opportunity to, extend the gap or close the gap on my championship rival. And it's an opportunity that I need to take. And that sort of gets to his head a bit. And then, he makes these mistakes in qualifying, like we saw yesterday. He clipped the barriers, or he just doesn't make inroads on that top 4, that top 3 during the race. He just takes it too easy because that pressure is getting to him. And it's just, if he wants to be world champion in 2025, he needs to be capitalizing on races like we had today. With Oscar crashing out on lap 1, this was Lando's opportunity to finish in the top 3, close that gap down to 7 points or so, back to what it was before Zandvoort, and he hasn't capitalized. And this is what, if we get to the end of the season and Oscar wins this title, Lando is going to be looking back on these moments. Baku 2025, qualifying and the race. Jeddah Q3, Monza, stuff like this, where Piastri has fumbled the bag, and it's opened up the door for Lando to make an inroad on Oscar, and he just doesn't take these moments. And coming into the season, if Oscar wins, he'll be looking back on these moments with quite a bit of disdain. But 7 races to go, anything can happen. But Lando needs to capitalize on these moments, on these rare moments from Oscar, because we got to remember, while Oscar did make that mistake, obviously he is all to blame for it. It's not common. We've only really seen 2 crashes from Oscar this year, which was in Australia and in Baku qualifying. So it's a rare occurrence for Oscar these days. So Lando needs to capitalize on it more. But we're gonna move on, and with Lando not capitalizing, we're just gonna briefly touch on this. It opens the door for championship back on for Max Verstappen. Is it possible? He's won 2 on the trot now, Monza and Baku. He's got more poles than anyone this season, which is no mean feat considering the pace of that McLaren. And Is the championship back on for Max? I don't think so. He's won 2 on the bounce now. I know a few people were floating around online saying that McLaren are starting to fall away in pace. I don't believe that is the case. I believe obviously it's deceptive in the fact that, Max dominated in Monza and then dominated today. There are reasons for that. Obviously, if we think back to Monza, Max did dominate, but McLaren were P2 and P3. I think that was more of a case of Max and Red Bull just getting the setup bang on. That wasn't any indication that the car was any better than what it was, and that certainly wasn't an indication that McLaren were falling off a cliff. And this weekend, obviously Max led from start to finish. I believe Carlos Sainz and Liam Lawson had a big part to play in that. Obviously, essentially acting as Max's rear gunners, although they're not part of the same team. Having a Williams and an RB in your top 3 is always going to help. But obviously, with McLaren's pace, being DNF and 8th and 7th in the race, and then being 7th and 9th in quali, I think it is just one off weekend for McLaren. When we've seen dominant runs in the past from teams, it's always been like every team has their off weekends. McLaren was Baku this year. Obviously, Red Bull had their off weekend, if you remember back to Singapore 2023, where they won all but one race, and the car just didn't work around Singapore. But we get these from teams. Every team, when they have a dominant run, there is always going to be one race where they're not as much on the pace, and that is what we saw with McLaren today. But it does beg the question: is the championship on for Max Verstappen? I believe the gap between him and Lando Norris is now 44 points. Look, if McLaren keep doing what they did in Baku this weekend, the championship is on for Max. It would take a very big miracle for that to happen. But yeah, if McLaren keep doing the pace that they do in Baku and keep crashing, the championship is on. But I don't believe that McLaren and Lando and Oscar will keep crashing. So in my eyes, I don't think the championship is on for Max. But hey, it's always fun to speculate. And, you never know. We might get to Abu Dhabi and it might be a 3-point gap between all 3 of them. You never know. But, yeah. It's always fun to speculate, but I don't think it is on for Mr. Max Verstappen. But we're going to move on into the final part of this podcast. And that is Carlos Sainz Podium. Honestly, what a drive from the Williams, starting P2, finishing P3. Smooth operator is back, and you can't fault him. Obviously, quite a few people would be quick to jump on he got lucky in qualifying. Now, he kind of did. I wouldn't say that his qualifying result was 100% skill. There was definitely quite a bit of involved with the rain and the red flags and things like that. But he still had to be there when it mattered, starting in P2. Obviously, it was highly unlikely that he was gonna overtake Max down into turn 1. But to be in second for a good half of the race, obviously you had the hard charging George Russell coming up and overtaking him with about 15 laps to go. I don't think there was much he could have done against George. George just had the pace, had the strategy locked down, so I don't think there was much Carlos could have done in his Williams. But to finish P3, a fantastic result, and getting Williams' first podium since Spa 2021. So an absolutely fantastic result for him. I'm very, very happy because I'm a big Williams fan, and I've been waiting for another podium for 3 years now. or 4 years actually, considering it's 2025. So yeah, a bit of a masterstroke from Carlos. You know, when we like in the past, when we see midfield and back marker teams qualify highly, you know, normally we see them drop back. You know, Magnussen at Brazil in 2022. Obviously, if you remember, he qualified on pole, um, and did not finish. Sorry, finished seventh in the sprint race and then did not finish the main race. Nico Hulkenberg on pole in the Williams in 2010 dropped back quite severely, and you know that is a common theme. So normally when we see slower cars on the front row of the grid or in the top three, normally they tend to drop back. So for Carlos to not drop back, is a very valiant effort and one that needs to be commended. Obviously, Alex Albon has done most of the point scoring for Williams this year, and we cannot forget that. Obviously, I believe the point ratio at Williams at the moment, I believe, is 70% to 30% in Albon's favour of points scored. So we cannot forget that that Alex is still doing a lot of the work. But you know, we've still got to commend Carlos on a fairly nice podium today in Baku. But that is all I am going to talk about today. Well, there we have it, everybody. Hopefully you all enjoyed another edition of Thomas's F1 race reviews. I know might have been a shorter one. I'm not entirely sure of the time length, but regardless of that, hopefully you all enjoyed. As always, if you want to stay up to date with every time I post, what I'm posting, etc., 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 go join my Discord. The link will be in my Spotify bio and in my YouTube bio for those of you who watched today. And go follow me on TikTok, which is up here. There is my account up there. I post sort of content up there, so go and do that if you haven't already. But that is going to be it for me. Stay safe, have an awesome day, make good choices. I'm going to see you all in the next video. Take care, everybody. Ciao.